Are return to office policies about productivity or control? Does 2 plus 2 equal 5? Should adults get the same summer breaks as students? We answer these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds to find the most interesting takes, and we like to critique what they got right or wrong. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to like and share. Helps us out a ton. You can follow us on socials at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, we'll get into the takes. So the first one is, first I've got sort of a quote from a recent article that came out, I want to say from Business Insider, maybe. And it was an interview with Mark, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it. Is Benioff, is that right? Mm-hmm. Who's the CEO of Salesforce. And this was an article talking about how he's a remote worker, and he doesn't really like to work in office, but he's incorporated a 3-day-a-week policy return for his company. And so this quote from the article reads, Salesforce's return to office mandate now requires non-remote employees to go into the office 3 days a week. Non-remote and customer-facing employees have to go in 4 days a week, while engineers only have to work from the office 10 days each quarter. And then this Twitter account referencing the article, not this quote specifically, I just pulled it for context, but they tweet, "Do as I say, not as I do." And then quoting him, "Well, I'm a remote worker. I've always been a remote worker my whole life. I don't work well in an office. It just doesn't work for my personality. I can't tell you why." Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff. It's about control, not productivity. What do you make of the take regarding this?
This is kind of a gray one to me. I wouldn't say it's neither good nor bad. I think that all businesses that want to survive and that want to do a good job do care about productivity, and any sort of control that they try to seize is in an effort to increase productivity. I mean, obviously, sometimes there can be individual managers or individual leaders that have some sort of ego that want control, but at the end of the day, all decisions are made with the almighty dollar sign at the bottom of it. And I think that with especially with I've worked a lot with Salesforce, not as I've been an employee, but I've purchased from them and done things like that. And a lot of their customer facing employees and stuff, that type of environment in sales does benefit from being in the office with your colleagues to work. That's not to say that I don't know, there are certain job functions, and this is what I mean to say, is that there are certain job functions that are better served by being together. You can't just work remotely and expect to be as productive as if you were in an office where you can literally peek your head out the door or outside of your cubicle and ask a question to someone. And then there are other jobs that are a little bit more abstract or don't require that, or you work a little bit more independently, such as a job like a CEO, where you are, you have a close set of 6 to 8 people that report to you that you are trying to get your agenda down through to the rest of the organization. It doesn't necessarily require you be in the office next to them, because you're probably working all around the world or country or wherever a lot of the time. Likewise with an engineer, right? The type of interaction that you're doing with your various types of colleagues is not the same as if you're sales or in a customer support facing role. So I don't know. It's this remote work thing. I just think it's whatever does lead to productivity. And I remember talking to a venture capitalist when we were trying to raise money and talking about maybe the buildings will go away and stuff like that. He's like, no, I think there's a culture that I think in culture and in business, people are more productive when they get together and they work as a team. In general, that's not always true, but in general, and that's going to be something that you're fighting uphill to say, if you want to try and move everyone to remote work. So I do think businesses always want control, but just because they want control doesn't mean that they also don't want productivity. Most of the time when they want control, it's to spur on more productivity.
I tend to think that in this particular case, I am conflicted about the take in general, and also about this particular instance of return to work. I think as it stands, the bigger corporations that want return to office and these kinds of policies, I actually do think that it is in many cases about control, because of the fact that you can look at a lot of the studies that show productivity, or employees can show their own productive levels. They can turn those in, and yet companies will not necessarily grant exemptions in a lot of cases based on productivity. I know that companies like Amazon will grant exceptions for very, very specific medical reasons, but the vast majority of these exemptions have gotten denied. And this is, I mean, like the example I always run to is, they went fully remote because of COVID, and then they started mandating these return to office policies. And then they were mandating that employees who had never been in person start coming into a headquarters.
Yeah.
It's like, I was hired 10 years ago, not me, but an individual who resigned. It's like, it was hired like 10 years ago, had always been remote, and then was now saying, hey, you need to relocate your home to come into an office that's, one of our headquarters. To me, that's not about productivity. That is about control. And so to me, it's when the Salesforce CEO is saying, I've always been someone who doesn't work well in an office, but now I'm gonna make this mandate without a good exception. I get skeptical, and I tend to agree with you that businesses do have to be responsive to market incentives, but in this case, I cringe a little bit, because it's like, well, maybe having this, and I don't know Salesforce specifically, so I do want to give some benefit of the doubt here. But if the company is not willing to make exceptions based on productivity, and like someone who, again, maybe their entire team might work across the country from them already, and so coming into an office is them physically showing up to a building for no reason other than to check in your badge, that's not about productivity. That is about control. And so the one thing I want to give Salesforce kudos for is that snippet above shows customer-facing employees have to go in 4 days a week. Well, engineers only have to do 10 each quarter. I still wonder about the engineers having to come in 10 a quarter. To me, it seems like, shouldn't it be something like engineers have to come in for certain like all hands meetings or something like that? Like on a need basis makes way more sense than an arbitrary number of days per quarter. But having that distinction at least shows that there is a little bit of nuance going into this, because I've always said with remote work, it's not a right. You shouldn't just get remote work, because there are some jobs that do need to be done in person. There are some jobs that will be more productive in person. But to me, I think that the more like having a policy like this is fine if you're also making the most informed decisions when it comes to individual employees. If you're granting exceptions because someone can say, look, I can get all of my stuff done, I am productive, I'm fulfilling my obligation to you as an employer, our employee-employer contract here is being met, and I'm not spending this money, to me at that point, then a business can require you to come in, but it's not about productivity at that point. It is about control, because otherwise they're just incurring expense. Because commuting is a pay cut to a remote employee.
Yes.
And that's just the reality of it.
Yeah. I'd be curious. With those studies, what I've taken issue with before is that like individual productivity is different than like organizational productivity. Potentially. I'm not saying in all cases.
Yeah.
And so like I would just like to believe, and maybe you're right in a lot of these instances, that it is just purely about control, but maybe in the same way that, if a point guard on a basketball team decides to play a certain way that emphasizes like, oh yeah, I scored 60 points every single game, but then all of the rest of the teammates do not score any points, and then you're losing games. That's not overall productivity, I think, is what matters. And I don't know. I would have to look at some more of these studies, but the 2 studies that I have looked at on this, and this was back in 2021, like they didn't necessarily address that aspect of it, right? Like individuals were more productive on certain metrics that were very individually related, but not necessarily from like a team standpoint or an overall organizational standpoint. And there's also the other added thing, like someone I know that's close to me, like, their company signed re-upped all their leases really, right before COVID and stuff. And it's like, oh, well, we want to be able to get use out of these buildings, right? So there's a lot of different things that are at play.
But even there, I would take issue there, because if you're having people come in for its own sake into a building,
that's
that
not
doesn't make
good.
a lot of sense either, right?
Yeah, it's not good. And so I'm not saying productivity. Like there are other things other than productivity that could be the motivation. For why they want them to come in. Not necessarily good or bad or indifferent, but
right.
Yeah, it's not always just control. But at the end of the day, the companies that are able to prove their thesis about whether they should be remote or they should be in person or whatever are the ones that are going to be able to survive. And the
Right.
ones that don't survive, well, I guess the thesis will be disproven.
Well, and to me, I think that the other potential motivator for in particular for big companies that are major employers in cities is the oh so sweet hand of the government coming in and saying, hey, we're going to give you tax breaks, but if you're not having your people come in so that the
Mm,
local economy here gets filled, well then we're not going to give you these tax breaks anymore. And of course, the city's incentive is to raise tax revenue to help support businesses in the city and all that kind of thing. But that is again an external pressure, not that doesn't have to do with the company's real productivity. It's an artificial productivity
yeah.
because the mafia government's coming in and saying, hey, if your employees come in and patronize the mafia run stores here, not that the small businesses in a city are, but the mafia approved businesses here, then maybe we won't put the pressure on you so much. Otherwise, maybe you're going to have you paying those taxes again, which is a perverse incentive in some ways. And I do think that it is worth noting that it's probably hard for a lot of those studies to talk about overall productivity just because of the turbulent years of 2020, 2021, 2022, just between COVID shutdowns, massive inflation, just any sort of reasonable signals about how businesses are doing is so wildly distorted because of the crazy unprecedented government interventions we've had in the past few years. So I wouldn't even know what to make, even if a report came out and said, all these companies are doing way better through remote work. I wouldn't even necessarily trust that just because we
Sure.
have no idea what's actually going on. Well, we know what's going on. We don't have actual numbers showing what's going on, and what's going on is not great.
Yeah.
Okay. Unless you have anything else to add,
No.
we'll go to okay. This is from Vivek Ramaswamy. He tweets, free speech doesn't just protect the ideas we love, it protects the ideas we hate. The idiotic college pro Palestine student groups are dead wrong to excuse genocidal attacks against Jews and spout disgusting anti Semitism. But one of the things that makes us different from Islamic terrorists is that we don't silence dissent. It's a shameful political ploy for Ron DeSantis to ban the existence of pro-Palestinian student groups at Florida universities. It's unconstitutional. It's utter hypocrisy for someone who railed against left-wing cancel culture. Conservatives should be allowed to criticize BLM or vaccine mandates, and crazy liberals should be able to criticize Israel or the West, even if they're dead wrong about it. I'm well aware this isn't a politically popular position right now, but if the government can censor who can speak versus not, the rest of it really doesn't matter. We are no different than those who we pretend to fight. What do you make of this take?
This is good. Yeah, I was. There's another Nikki Haley tweet that I thought about including, but we kind of addressed it already in her. It was just an expanded version of her anti-Zionism is also anti-Semitism tweet that we did last episode. But everyone is kind of tipping over themselves to out Israel each other when it comes to support for our oldest and dearest friend. So that was kind of in her response to Ron DeSantis talking about his banning the existence and funding of any university that allows pro-Palestinian student groups. And what Vivek gets right here, which is awesome, is that everything that you use today to harm your opponents, your ideological opponents, rather than to actually just destroy them on the debate stage or in the realm of public opinion through actually asking good questions and making good points and arguments. If you don't do that, your mechanisms of coercion and force will be eventually used against you. And it might not even be used against you today or tomorrow or next year or the year after that. But as we've seen, like with the COVID mandates that we've talked about in Obama using the FBI to investigate or the IRS to, hammer his own conservative opponents. And then now we're seeing the FBI arresting people that weren't even at January 6th, but actually just voice some sort of supportive opinion about it. These mechanisms and these infrastructures and these systems will be turned against you. And the best way to avoid that is for everyone to just have a principled opinion and not actually, be kind of shifty about when they can apply it and when they don't want to apply it. It's really disappointing to see people like Ron DeSantis either, be ignorant of this willfully or unwillfully.
Yeah, I think this is a great take, and I think that it's important to distinguish that everything he's saying here is not contradictory to stopping the insane mobs, right? The insane quote unquote, protests that end up chasing, Jewish students into a library, for instance. I don't know if you saw this that happened recently. I don't remember which college campus, where the librarians literally said the Jewish students could hide in the attic, which is just such a like I don't blame the librarians, but you're like, oh my gosh, that is crazy imagery. And the problem is that now that kind of reaction is then associated with any kind of actual protest you might have against the Israeli response. Anything that's not Israel needs to go in there and bomb the living heck out of everyone. If you don't believe that, then you're now associated with these people who are chasing Jews into, college campus libraries and threatening them. That is not what Vivek is talking about. And pro-Palestinian student groups as a whole being targeted for this is crazy. To me, it almost has echoes of the idea of sending all Japanese citizens into concentration camps, because there might be some, pro-Japan citizens there, which is just a wild thing to, I don't know, just a wild measure to take. And I think it rightfully shows how misguided this policy would be. So I think Vivek here is completely correct. I think he's completely showing that the boomerang effect is real and will happen. But I think he also isn't precluding cases where there's actual violence being incited.
Yeah, I don't have any more to add on it.
All right, we'll move on. All right, this I had to look this up, and this is a professor at City University of New York. And he tweets, the whole 2 + 2 = 5 thing came up again, and I thought of a practical, actual real-world example. And he quote tweets himself replying to someone. And he says, if my cookie recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of salt and I heap the teaspoons a bit every time because it tastes better, then if I double the recipe for someone, I might just write it down as 5. 2 + 2 = 5. What do you think about this logic?
But then they're adding 5 teaspoons to the recipe. It's like I saw this other example. Someone posted the 2 people looking at a 6 or a 9, and they're both looking at one's looking at it from the bottom, the other is looking at it from the top, or vice versa, depending on what you think it is. And someone commented, they said, well, like this whole debate about whether it's a 6 or a 9 is irrelevant, because like what if a tractor just went in that position and like drew that specific sequence in the dirt? Like it's neither a 6 or a 9. It's up to whatever the interpretation is. And it's like, no, it's just a squiggle in the ground made by a tractor. That's the truth of the matter of what it is. It's neither a 6 or a 9. Yeah, it's a squiggle in the ground. And exactly. So if it was drawn there, someone drew it with the intention of it either being a 6 or a 9, or maybe it's the letter of their alien alphabet that we don't know yet, but it's information that someone is trying to convey in some way or form or fashion. And if it can just be open to interpretation, then that information is actually meaningless and we can't actually glean anything from it. And we might as well not communicate at all. In the same way, this whole recipe thing, it's like, hey, like if you're changing the recipe from, 2 teaspoons of salt or whatever to 5 or 4 or whatever it's going to be, like you're changing the information you're trying to convey to the person that's trying to cook. And if that person said, well, 5 doesn't seem like it's enough or 5 seems like it's too much to me, too much saltiness to me, I'm going to bring it back down to 2, then they're actually making a different recipe than you are, just as you are making a different recipe than the original recipe you were trying to make.
That's I like the tractor thing, like as if this is just a common thing, like reader interpretation of something is what something means. And it's like you can find meaning out of things that are not intentional, but that doesn't mean that's the thing that you got inspiration from means that thing. In the same way, if I write out a sentence and someone who's dyslexic misreads that sentence because they've interpreted it wrong because of their brain, that doesn't mean I wrote the sentence the way that their brain interpreted it. That doesn't mean I meant the thing that they interpreted it as. And so, in this stupid example, you're saying he's just playing this stupid game where he's like, look, 2 + 2 = 5. Now 2 has to equal actually not 2 in order for this situation to work. And that's all he's doing. Saying 2 with a little extra more. Okay, well that's more than 2. That's not that's not 2 teaspoons of salt anymore. That's 2 teaspoons plus extra. So if, for instance, you just said double the recipe, then anyone who is making that would do 4 teaspoons all heaped with a little bit of extra. That might equal 5 total, but the doubling doesn't make 2 + 2 = 5. You're misdefining the things. And it's funny because numbers are the clearest way to define this reality, which is why I think postmodernists really, really are trying to attack this, because it is such a objective, definite reality that they don't like to deal with. But it's like, if you're saying 2 with a little bit extra, that has a numeric value. Whether or not you measure it does not change the fact that 2 plus a little bit extra is like 2.25 or 2.5, or a teaspoon with a little bit extra might be 1.25 teaspoons or 1.12 teaspoons. There is a real objective measurable number there, and just because you don't measure it that way doesn't mean that the objective real data of 2 + 2 now equals 5. You can't take your definition of something and then say that because you have misdefined it, the objective definition from everyone has to go to your convention there. It's just a bizarre, backwards way of thinking something, and really it made me think of the classic what is a woman?
Yeah.
University thing where, well, what do you think a woman is? And well, woman's anyone who defines it as, but then you have the specific definition that everyone has to take. It's just backwards circular logic that doesn't work in the real world. And that's the crazy thing. He calls it a real world example. Bro, that's anything but.
Anything but. Yeah, the my favorite is when he's talking with the Matt Walsh is talking with the university professor. He's like, "Can you tell me what a woman is?" And the professor goes, "Well, it's anyone who identifies as a woman." And Matt Walsh goes, "Well, what is that?" It's like, You can't. I mean, in the most basic sense of logic, you cannot use the term that you are trying to define in the definition that in your definition that you're trying to espouse. Because it's like, then it's just circular. It doesn't make any sort of sense. And I guess what this all kind of gets down to, the heart of the matter, is that there is right and there is wrong. Because if you can define something, that means you can also define something else as not that thing. And if you can define something else as not that thing, then there is right or wrong, and that means that there is a proper or improper way to live, which is just a nightmare for any sort of moral relativist to deal with. Because at the heart, in my opinion, the heart of the matter for them is that they just want to live whatever way they want to, whatever way feels good. And anything that could come against that, anything that could define it as not a good way to live, to them is viewed as bad. I mean, that's the only type of bad that exists in their world.
Well, and just to emphasize that point, think about how contradictory their own stance is to their position. They're saying that 2 + 2 can equal 5 because it's all about interpretation, and then they're defining that reality can be that or has to be that way. You're saying that reality, this thing that is ever shifting and malleable, has to be defined, which is just bonkers to say. So entirely, self-contradictory, the classic perspective of someone in that position. But anyway, just a funny little thing I thought I'd throw in there.
And this is, for parents, this is the professor you were sending your kid to study under.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So just remember that this is public university at its finest. Okay. Our next take here comes from Phoenix Ammunition, and it reads, "Anti-gunners will never understand that the entire point of owning guns is so that you have the ability to say no and actually mean it. Anti-gunners are like people who force themselves on you. They hate the word no, and they'll do anything they can to force you to do things you don't want." All right, thoughts?
This is a great take. It's a little bit crass in some ways, and I think people that understand what Donnie meant by force themselves on people, what he meant by that. But it's true. Just because it's crass doesn't mean it's not true. And a lot of pro-Second Amendment people will get in the trap of saying, like, well, we should be able to use it for hunting, or I need to have this or do that. It's like, no. The point of the Second Amendment is so that we could say no. to a tyrant, or to someone breaking into our house, or to someone that is on the street threatening us with a knife, or someone coming and telling us that we need to do something that we don't need to do and we have no obligation to do. That's the point of the Second Amendment, is to give us that power. And it made me think about how, people will be like, well, isn't that going to lead to a really violent and nasty society? Because anytime someone wants to not do something, then maybe there's going to be a gunfight. And it made me think about, like, in two instances where I've worked, one in a business that primarily worked online, and then another in the startup that I worked in where we were working face to face with a lot of people. In the online business, like, you would get the nastiest, most meanest comments about a product. People could say very personal things to you when you're trying to moderate something or trying to, address a complaint. Just the nastiest of escalations, time and time and time and time again. And then in contrast that, I could literally have someone to go tell me to go F myself at the startup. We'd be in person, blue collar worker, very scary looking dude that's physically worked his whole life. And we'd be discussing things, but there was always a cap on the amount of personal escalation that could occur, because there were two people in a room. And if the escalation went above a certain threshold, like, it was guaranteed that there was going to be physical violence. And so we could eventually get to, hey, my wife left me. I feel really bad about what I said, and I'm just really scared that your technology is going to take my job. And, yay, we hug, we cry it out, everything's good. Whereas with the person online, there is no potential consequence in our interaction that could occur. And so therefore, they feel free to say whatever they want, and they want to escalate it. And what's always funny about meeting someone online in person is that they're usually not even half as aggressive in person as they are on the internet. And that's how this would go with guns, right? If there's always the implicit outcome that could occur if escalation goes above and beyond a certain amount, like, it's never going to go above that, because unless it is deemed that, like, the consequences of escalating and going above that is worth more than the potential of just saying no or saying yes in that type of confrontation. And so I think that an arms, as the cliche goes, an armed society is a polite society, because it's like, hey, we actually all need to treat each other with a certain level of decorum and respect, because we're all capable of awfulness towards each other. So therefore, we should all behave well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was just thinking about the fact that the entire, like, narrative on guns has been so polluted that when you say something that is totally reasonable, like, well, I'm going to bring a gun to de-escalate the situation, people are their minds are blown. Like, that's the counter narrative to what the public perception is. But in reality, I think that this puts it exactly in the right way. And like you demonstrate, when you're in person, when there is the higher risk, that is the de-escalating factor, because people know things can get real. And so being able to say no and actually meaning it is a de-escalation, because otherwise, when you say no, there's nothing to back that up, and things can escalate beyond what they otherwise would. And so it's frustrating, because people can misuse tools all the time, and that doesn't mean that the principle of Second Amendments or self-defense, again, to me, I feel like I'm a broken record a little bit, but to me, it's never about specifically a gun as it is about self-defense. And guns right now are the most accessible means to self-defense for an individual, but that could change, right? If lightsabers suddenly became a thing in our reality, I would say we have the right to bear lightsabers, and not, whatever your means to self-defense is, that is in fact the tool with which de-escalation occurs, and it's the tool with which you ought to be able to defend yourself, even if it's a tool that can be abused, because humans are moral creatures that can take immoral actions, that can make evil choices and do things, and they will use whatever is around them. And because that is the reality, no matter what tools you do or don't have, just burying your head in the sand and pretending that, if you pass a law or something like that, that guns will go away. It's just it's incredibly naive, and it doesn't acknowledge the reality that the people who want to do bad things will find ways to do them no matter what. And so all you're doing is taking away that ability to say no and actually meaning it, that this post describes. which
Yes.
which is a really good way of putting it.
I'm sure you remember this, but when with all of the COVID mandates that were occurring here in Washington State, many of them very unpopular, as well as the revelations that the Inslee administration knew that the COVID vaccines didn't work, yet they still fired a bunch of state employees and the like. Regardless, a lot of people were very angry about that, and it was kind of coincidental, right, that during this entire season of COVID and all of the increased government control and business being shut down and people being angry about it, they decided they were going to ban being able to have any sort of weapon in the Capitol here in Washington State. And it's because, there is an implicit like, hey, there's certain lines you should not cross as the government. Like, we will respect some of your authority up until a certain point, but we always have the option to say no. We have the ability to, if need be, to take it from you by force, that authority that you've taken. And so it was very telling to me when they banned any sort of gun within the Capitol, yet they themselves will, and they will always do it under the guise of like safety and all this stuff. But it's like, no, like, you protect yourself with guns. Inslee has armed people around him to protect him in security, as well as most of the politicians around do. And yet, their banning of guns from people that are peaceful, that use them lawfully, that train with them, that are awesome about them, that read up on them, research them, do all this stuff. The reason they treat them that way is because they're afraid that at some point maybe it's a threat to them. And it kind of made me think about how, like, my niece, like, she's a big time extrovert, loves hanging out with my wife and I and everything. And whenever we go over to their house, like, she wants us to spend as much time as possible there. But the second we start putting on our shoes, even if we're not necessarily leaving, maybe we're going to go on a walk outside, or maybe I'm running out to the car to grab something, she gets kind of upset and tries to start convincing me to not put my shoes on because she thinks it means that I'm going to be leaving. And that's kind of what these gun people are like, or anti-gun people are like. They're like, hey, if people are armed, that means that they could tell me, a weak person that can't persuade them with arguments, that we're not going to do that. They want to be the only ones holding guns. Just because they're anti-gun doesn't mean they're anti-gun for themselves. They're just anti-gun for you. They want to have the gun pointed at you, and not vice versa.
Yeah, and that's always the reality. I mean, that's why during COVID, another great example, that's why you saw Gavin Newsom at parties unmasked. It's why you saw all the celebrities taking their masks down. And it's like, people who are really privileged and preach these messages, in a way, they're some of the most classist people imaginable, because all it is really a power and money concern. Because if there's a rabid homeless drug addict on the street waving a knife around, they've got armed security they can pay for to protect them. But they don't want you to have that ability to protect your own self with a firearm, because if they don't want to ban private security, as far as I know. And so in some sense, that means that you could still hire that. So that's, again, a thing for money. And if they did ban private security, then they're even more classist, in that you can only be part of the elite government class in order to have access to protection. So depending on how extreme you want to go with it, all it is a matter of how much do you think regular and poor people should be able to defend themselves? Because the people who say they want to take away all guns, they're really hurting the lower income people more than anyone else, because those are the people who have the least access to external resources to give themselves the ability to say no and mean it.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is our last take for this episode. We've got a tweet that reads, "It's annoying that we recognize that children need things like a summer break and several vacations a year, but we think it makes sense to have adults work for 60 years with maybe 2 to 3 weeks off a year if you're lucky." All right, what do you make of this take, Britt?
Oh, there's a lot in this one. One, I'm a big proponent of homeschooling. I do not believe that you necessarily need it. I'm happy for kids to have a summer break. Plus, I'm also happy for my kids to have time during the normal school season, school week, to not be sitting in class for 8 hours a day. So maybe if we did less of that, they might not need an entire summer break and several vacations a year, because they're just spending their time being kids instead of being, mindless drones in a classroom. But there's this weird, like, cultural zeitgeist about, like, what kids do is what adults should do. Yeah. As if there's no difference between kids and adults. As if, like, oh yeah, if you dropped a kid, like drop a kid in the middle of the jungle, and a kid that doesn't necessarily know how to do anything, and say, hey, you could still be a kid in this jungle. Everything that you did at home, waking up and eating cereal if it exists and watching Saturday morning cartoons and not working, you can do that here. And it's like, yeah, the kid is not going to have cereal. They don't have any Saturday cartoons, and they're quickly going to get eaten or starve to death in the middle of the jungle. That is what it means to be an adult, right? Like, we're not dropped off in the middle of a jungle, but we're dropped off in the middle of reality where we need to create things and build things and gather food in order for us to survive. We have to work 60 years because, and we might actually have to work more than that. The only reason kids don't have to work is because grown-ups do work and provide for people and create things and build things and gather food and such. So, we're lucky that we get 2 to 3 weeks off a year. Some people get more, some people get less, but it's all in an effort for us to survive. It's not in like, there's some principle that we should be just like kids and it could exist, the second we choose to do so. I'm sure everyone, if it was a reality that we could live like kids for our entire 90 years of life, I'm pretty sure everyone would try to do it, but that's just not the reality if you want to make it to age 90.
I'm gonna give my own version of this take here. It's annoying that we recognize that children need things like a bib and a diaper, but it makes sense to have adults have to go to the bathroom on their own and clean up with a napkin and not spill on themselves if we're lucky. Like,
that's good.
It's just it's part of, like, kids need to develop. They need time. You need to build your ability to learn, to work, to produce. But it's also not like we have this agreement everywhere, like, okay, we're living in such a way that you don't ever get breaks ever. It's like our society developed out of need too. Like, we don't just get to have a break from needing to eat and needing to create and needing to repair. A hurricane tears through your home, and it's like, it doesn't matter what you have on your calendar, you have to repair that. You don't get the choice. So we're in such an opulent state of our culture that people are so disconnected from reality that they don't recognize that the reason why we don't just get breaks, quote unquote, is because we have to, provide resources. We have to keep producing things in order to outpace the rate at which we consume things. Children are just parasites. Them being in school is not actually a productive thing that generates resources. It's an investment. So, it's not even an apples to apples comparison of school and work. They're entirely different functions. I don't primarily go to work in order to be enriched and learn in the same way that we want kids to learn and get enriched from school. Again, better done through homeschooling. They're entirely different functions just because they are sort of occupations that are governmentally required in many cases, although work not as much. But it's like these obligations we have. It's like people just equate them. Oh, they are the same thing. Kids spend their days at school and adults spend their days at work. Therefore, they are equivalent in every way, shape, and form. How come the kids get breaks and we don't? It's because they're functionally different things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I saw this other article talking about how adults who are childless are happier than adults that have children. And it's like, yeah, that's true in some ways, but it's like what is fulfilling? What is your actual purpose on this earth? What is it to actually grow your family and to give yourself up for another person? Like, happiness versus joy and how that's all measured. And I think it just really points to how we have infantilized so many adults. Like, adults grow up. Maybe you've seen the video of the gal complaining about the 9 to 5. I don't know if you've caught that one yet. And it's just it's really hard to make existence occur. Like, you don't just exist without anything, without things being produced, without work occurring. And I think a lot of adults are entering into a world realizing that my parents sacrificed so much for me just to exist. It took a lot of effort. It took a lot of hard work. It took a lot of no sleep. It took a lot of, long hours working at the office or in the fields or at your job, wherever you're doing it. And you have to not only provide for yourself, but make extra so that the person that is not working, that you don't want to have work, can just take the Saturday morning off and watch cartoons. So that is a really harsh reality when you get to it. And what's really sad is that so many people are just shirking that off, right? And they're being like, oh no, I can live at home, or I can do this or do that. And why should I have to work? Why can't I be just like a kid the rest of my life? It's like, well, the fact of the matter is that's just not reality. 2 + 2 does not equal 5, and not making food means you will be empty stomach. You'll have an empty stomach if you don't. So hopefully we can all kind of start waking up to this here soon, because if not, we're going to have no stuff and a lot of people that are hungry for stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think I have anything more, so I think we'll wrap up this episode. Cool. Thanks so much for tuning in. As a reminder, just make sure to like and comment if you've got anything you want to say. Love to hear your takes, and we'll see you on the next one.